March 11th, 1945. A humid, moonless night in the Ulithi Atoll. The deep, dark waters of the Pacific Lagoon are filled with the silhouettes of the most powerful naval force ever assembled. On the hangar deck of the USS Randolph, the tension of the front lines feels a world away. Nearly 200 sailors are gathered in the dim light. They are laughing. They are relaxed. A movie is playing on a makeshift screen, a rare moment of peace in a world defined by fire and steel. But 1,500 miles to the north, 24 shadows are screaming across the ocean. They have been flying for hours. They have no intention of going home. It is a one-way trip, a mission of total destruction. And while the sailors on the Randolph watch the flickering screen, the fire of the rising sun is closing in.
To understand the Randolph, you have to understand the sheer, terrifying scale of American industrial might. She was the 17th Essex-class carrier to be born from the shipyards of Newport News. Laid down in May 1943, she was commissioned just 18 months later. In a span of only 2 years, 13 of these massive steel beasts had been unleashed upon the waves. It was a production pace the world had never seen and would never see again. Named after a patriot of the Revolution, the Randolph was built for one purpose: to break the back of the Japanese Empire. She didn't wait for the war to come to her. After a lightning-fast shakedown in the Caribbean, she plunged straight into the heart of the Pacific. By February 1945, her flight deck was humming with the sound of Hellcats and Avengers. She arrived just in time to support the blood-soaked sands of Iwo Jima. Her planes tore through the skies over Japan, marking the first carrier-based strikes on the home islands since the legendary Doolittle raid. For the Marines on the ground at Iwo Jima, the Randolph was a guardian angel of thunder and lead. But as the fleet retired to the Ulithi anchorage for maintenance, the Angel was about to become a target. The Japanese High Command was desperate. Their navy was shattered, their air power depleted. But they still had the Special Attack Units. They launched Operation Tan No. 2. 24 Yokosuka P-1Y Francis medium bombers lifted off from Kyushu. Their target was Ulithi, the secret heart of the American logistics machine. It was an audacious, grueling flight. 1,500 miles across open water at the absolute limit of their range. Most of the attackers succumbed to the vastness of the sea or mechanical failure. Only 2 made it to the lagoon. They arrived an hour after sunset. The first pilot, blinded by the fading light and the deceptive terrain of the islands, mistook a signal tower for a carrier deck. He disintegrated against the earth of Sorlin Island. But the second pilot saw his prize: the massive, dark hull of an Essex-class carrier, the USS Randolph. The strike was silent and sudden. There was no radar warning, no frantic call to general quarters. Just the sudden, terrifying roar of twin engines growing louder until the sky itself seemed to vibrate. The bomber slammed into the Randolph's stern, just below the flight deck level. It struck with the force of a falling star, punching through steel and exploding directly into the area where the men were watching their movie. In an instant, the laughter was replaced by an inferno. The hangar deck became a charnel house of twisted metal and searing heat.
Shrapnel tore through the rows of seated men. 27 sailors were killed instantly. Another 105 were wounded, many of them burned beyond recognition. The Francis bomber had carried the fire of Kyushu deep into the belly of the ship. The lagoon, once a sanctuary, was now a scene of mechanical carnage.
The damage was severe, the kind that usually sent a carrier limping back to the shipyards of Pearl Harbor or the West Coast. But the Randolph's crew and the repair teams at Ulithi refused to give up. They worked in shifts, 24 hours a day, surrounded by the tropical heat and the smell of scorched paint. They didn't retire to the east. They stayed. They welded, they wired, and they rebuilt. It was a display of grit that matched the ship's industrial birth. In less than a month, the Randolph was back. Her flight deck was scarred but functional. Her spirit was unbroken. By April 1st, as the invasion of Okinawa began, the Randolph was back on station. Her planes were once again screaming over the Ryukyu Islands, striking airfields and naval bases with a renewed, vengeful fury. The Kamikaze had struck a blow, but the Randolph had absorbed it and stood back up. By May 1945, the war had reached a fever pitch. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, the legendary commander of the Carrier Task Force, was a man without a home. His flagship, the USS Enterprise, had been devastated by a kamikaze strike. Searching for a new platform to lead the most powerful striking force in naval history, he looked to the Randolph. On May 15th, he transferred his flag. The Randolph was now the flagship of Task Force 58. She led 10 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers, a massive armada that hammered the Japanese home islands day after day. Mitcher watched from her bridge as the airfields of Kyushu and the naval yards of Yokosuka were reduced to rubble. The Randolph had moved from a victim of a special attack to the brain of the entire American offensive. But death in the Pacific wasn't always carried by the enemy. In the sweltering heat of the Leyte Gulf, a new tragedy struck. It wasn't a Japanese bomber this time, but a freak accident that felt like a betrayal. A U.S. Army Air Force F-5E Lightning was performing a mock strafing run on the carrier, a display of skill that turned into a nightmare. On its second pass, the pilot lost control. The twin-engine fighter slammed into a cluster of planes parked on the Randolph's forward flight deck. The resulting explosion was a repeat of the horror at Ulithi. The pilot was vaporized. 14 Randolph sailors were killed in the fireball. 10 aircraft were reduced to charred skeletons. Even in the safety of an anchorage, the Randolph was a place where life was cheap and fire was a constant shadow. The ship mourned, cleaned the deck, and prepared for the final blow. July 1945. The end was near. The Randolph returned to the waters off Tokyo, her planes striking the very heart of the enemy. They hammered the Yokosuka Naval Yard, finding the battleship Nagato, a symbol of the Imperial Navy, and punishing it with heavy bombing raids. The Japanese defenses were withering, their sky empty of all but a few desperate defenders. The Randolph's planes flew mission after mission, rocketing and strafing airfields through the first half of August. On the morning of August 15, 1945,
Her pilots were returning from a strike on Tokyo Bay. Their guns were still hot. Their hearts were still in the fight. Then the word came across the radio. Cease all offensive actions. Japan had accepted the surrender terms. The war was over. The silence that followed was heavier than the roar of the engines.
The Randolph's journey didn't end with the peace. She turned from a weapon of war into a vessel of hope, participating in Operation Magic Carpet to bring thousands of battle-worn servicemen home to their families. But her story would span decades and frontiers. She sat in the reserve fleet, a sleeping giant, until the Cold War called her back to service. She was modernized with an angled flight deck, transformed into an attack carrier, and later a hunter of submarines. She stood guard during the Suez Crisis and the political storms of the Mediterranean. But perhaps her most legendary post-war moments came not from the sea, but from the stars. The Randolph became the primary recovery ship for the pioneers of the space age. She was there to pull astronauts Virgil Grissom and John Glenn from the Atlantic after their historic Mercury missions. In 1962, she stood on the front lines of the Cuban Missile Crisis, her group stalking Soviet attack submarines in the tense, silent waters of the blockade. The USS Randolph was a ship that refused to be forgotten. From the Kamikaze fires of 1945 to the edge of the space race, she was a testament to American resilience. When she was finally sold for scrap in 1975, she didn't just carry away a hull of steel. She carried the memories of a movie interrupted by fire, the flag of an admiral, and the legacy of a crew that would not let their ship sink.